Now that we have talked about every common feature of displays, from aspect ratios to hertz values, it is time we talked about the brief history of the origins of television. It is time we focus on the brief history of what made television in the first place. Naturally, it was something very different. You see, TV first became commercially available in the 1930s with the advent of the British Broadcasting Company, where soon enough they would appear in the United States in the 1940s. Though this was just the beginning of television, the viewing conditions were far from ideal. They had comically small screens and relied on a mechanical system to produce an image. An image that barely looked viewable. Not ideal by any means for viewing, especially for today's standards, but it nevertheless gained enough traction to claim all of the available frequencies that the FCC allocated to them. These frequencies were called VHF, short for very high frequencies, that consisted of a handful of television channels that would take up the available bandwidth until 1948, where the allocated space was filled up. So in 1952, the FCC would assign more frequencies to meet with the demand called UHF, or ultra-high frequencies. This would also be at the same time where the NTSC, or National Television Systems Committee, would be enacted. The standard would be 525 interlaced lines running at a minimum of 30 frames per second, which would provide acceptable quality while making sure to conserve frequency space for other channels. Around the same time, the RCA would debut an electronic system for televisions that would work with existing black and white systems, with the FCC adopting it 1 year later in 1953 and replacing the mechanical system. At this point, it was probably for the best, as again, mechanical scanning wasn't of the best quality. It was at this point that televisions would start to have bigger screens that weren't so comically small, where it was also a golden age for television, as this was after World War II with 100 stations on the air. Of course, televisions would continue to change in designs over the years and have new features added. For example, the concept of cable would begin in the late 1940s, early 1950s, which would become more formally recognized in the early 1970s, to then have the formal recognition regulations reduced in 1984. Cable at the time was essentially just another means of broadcasting a signal to television sets. Only this was a more wired variant that used radio frequency coaxial cables that mitigated several of the downsides of what were essentially radio antennas that had the ability to display video alongside audio.
Wait a minute. Nope, that's not it. No. Come on! Here, have some chocolate. There we go.
Cable is not to be confused with satellite television that has its signals distributed via a giant dish that would receive the signal. For example, my house used to use a giant dish network dish that would receive signals on the top of our house, where I think the signal would go out through the origins of the coaxial cable outlets into our set-top boxes and then into our televisions proper. At least I think that's how it works. Either that or the signal from the dish went directly to the set-top box itself and would connect to a TV via a physical connection, such as an analog or digital signal.